It is the 9th of June, 1865. A steam train is travelling through the picturesque Kent countryside in southeastern England on its way towards London. Suddenly, near Staplehurst, whilst passing over a viaduct, numerous carriages derail and are violently thrown into the dry riverbed of the river belt below, killing 10 people. Workmen removed track on the bridge, thinking no trains were due. The survivors scramble to help those in need, and amongst them is a famous writer in his mid-50s. In the chaos, he remembers that he has left the manuscript of his most recent work inside his carriage. After returning for it, he emerges from the wreckage with a copy of Our Mutual Friend in his hand, which, unbeknownst to him, will be the last book one of history's most famous authors will ever publish. His name? Charles Dickens, the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. The man known to history as Charles Dickens was born on the 7th of February 1812 in Portsmouth, in the county of Hampshire, in England. His father, John Dickens, was born in 1785 to Elizabeth Dickens, a housekeeper to John Crewe, a wealthy landowner and Whig politician. Despite his modest parentage, John lived in a house that was frequented by some of the leading Whig politicians of the day, including the fiery Liberal orator Charles James Fox and the statesman and political theorist Edmund Burke. In April 1805, John was appointed to the Navy Pay Office during Britain's war with Napoleonic France. By the time of his son Charles's birth, he was working in the Portsmouth dockyard as a clerk. John considered himself a man of culture and owned a large collection of books, but had a habit of living beyond his means and getting into debt, the consequences of which had a great impact on the upbringing of young Charles. Charles's mother was Elizabeth Barrow, a sister of Thomas Barrow, John's colleague at the Navy Pay Office. The couple married in June 1809. The Barrows were a cultured family, and Elizabeth's other brothers, John and Edward, were both writers and journalists who would go on to support their nephew Charles in his early forays into the literary world. In August 1810, John and Elizabeth had their first child, a daughter named Frances, or Fanny. Charles was their second child, and the couple would go on to have 6 more, of whom 2 died in infancy. The Dickens family was already in financial difficulty and moved house twice before John was recalled to the main Navy Pay Office at Somerset House in London and took the family to the capital. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, John Dickens was sent to Kent in late 1816. At around the time of Charles's 5th birthday, the family lived in Chatham near Rochester. In between the usual childhood games, Charles was taught to read by his mother. This allowed him to raid his father's library, which included Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, and the Arabian Nights, the collection of Middle Eastern folk tales that became a particular favorite. Charles later recalled being lonely and frequently ill, and he turned to reading when he was not well enough to play with the local boys. Charles enjoyed singing comic songs with his elder sister Fanny, who would become a professional musician, and the pair often visited the theatre. These experiences inspired Charles to write a tragic play of his own, Misnar, the Sultan of India, when he was a boy of around 8 years old, though the manuscript is lost. Charles and Fanny were initially sent to a dame's school run by local women, but later they were sent to a school run by William Giles, who considered Charles a promising student. In 1821, while taking Charles and Fanny on a walk, John Dickens pointed out Gads Hill on the Rochester to Gravesend Road, once a haunt of robbers and mentioned by Shakespeare in Henry IV Part 1 as the place where Sir John Falstaff organises a highway robbery. The 9-year-old Charles looked up at the brick mansion that stood on top of the hill and informed his father that he would like to live there, to which the latter said that he might do so if he worked hard enough. In June 1822, Charles's dreams of Gads Hill had to be set aside when his father was once again recalled to Somerset House, and the family moved to Camden Town, a new suburb in the northwest of an ever-expanding London, by that time the largest city in the world. Charles soon began making regular visits to his uncle, Thomas Barrow, who had fallen out with his father when John was unable to pay back a £200 loan. Barrow lived at Gerrard Street in Soho above a bookshop, whose owner, Mrs. Manson, allowed the boy to borrow her books. Among the books that influenced Charles was Dance of Death, a collection of prints by Renaissance artist Hans Holbein depicting rich and poor in skeletal form as equals in the face of death. Charles was disappointed that he could not continue his education and instead spent much of his time in the house helping his mother look after his younger siblings. He amused himself by writing detailed descriptions of people he met while wandering about the city. In April 1823, his sister Fanny was accepted into the Royal Academy of Music at a fee of 38 guineas a year, a fact that must have exacerbated Charles's disappointment that his education was being neglected. That autumn, as the family finances continued to deteriorate, Charles's mother, Elizabeth, attempted to set up a school of her own to teach local children. Although Charles helped his mother advertise the venture, there was no interest at all, and the scheme was abandoned. John Dickens's creditors continued to knock on his door, and in February 1824 he was arrested for non-payment of debt. He was taken to Marshalsea debtors' prison in Southwark. His father's absence left the 12-year-old Charles, as the man of the family, forced to take the family's possessions to the pawnbroker, parting with his precious books in the process. Charles was soon forced to work at Warren's blacking warehouse near Charing Cross, earning 6 shillings a week for placing lids onto pots of shoe polish and labelling them. He was moved by the kindness of the older boys who helped him, including a lad called Bob Fagin, whose name stuck in his head. Charles's mother decided to join her husband at Marshalsea, and Charles moved into lodgings close to the prison so he could join his family for dinner. In April 1824, John Dickens' mother, Elizabeth, died in her 80s, leaving her son £450. This enabled John to be discharged from debtors' prison in May, and the family soon moved to North London. While Charles continued to work in the blacking factory, he resented his sister's success at the Academy of Music, where she won a silver medal and was given the opportunity to perform in front of members of the royal family at a prize-giving ceremony. In March 1825, after his father was pensioned off by the Pay Office, Charles was allowed to quit his job. While his mother wanted him to continue working, John agreed to send Charles to Wellington House Academy, where he was taught Latin, mathematics, and English. In addition to his studies, he helped to stage theatrical performances at school and joined a classmate in putting together a rudimentary newspaper. In the spring of 1827, soon after his 15th birthday, Charles was obliged to leave school as his father could no longer pay the fees. At the same time, the family was once again forced to move. Charles once again had to find work, and his mother helped him find a job as a clerk at the law firm Ellis and Blackmore at Gray's Inn, near Holborn. The young man amused and impressed his colleagues with his art of mimicry and his ability to recite long passages from Shakespeare and joined them on trips to the theatre. In November 1828, he moved on to Charles Molloy's law office in nearby Chancery Lane, continuing to gain insights into the legal profession that confirmed his view that lawyers purposefully complicated matters to enrich themselves at the expense of the poor. That same year, John Dickens began working as a parliamentary reporter for his brother-in-law John Barrow's nascent newspaper, Mirror of Parliament. Charles was inspired to learn shorthand and left Molloy's office in 1829 to work as a court reporter. In May 1830, he met the 20-year-old Maria Beadnell, the daughter of a city banker, and soon fell in love with her. Although Maria seemed receptive, her parents did not consider Charles an acceptable suitor, and the latter was motivated to improve his station by working as a freelance parliamentary reporter for his uncle's paper. He did an impressive job and was hired as a staff reporter for the Mirror in Parliament by early 1832. He may have covered the debates on Whig Prime Minister Earl Grey's Reform Bill to expand the voter franchise and updated parliamentary constituency boundaries to account for the enlarged electorate, which was adopted as the Reform Act of 1832. Although Charles was a supporter of liberal reforms, he was not impressed by the speeches made in the House of Commons and believed that politicians were turning a blind eye to the poverty and penury around them in London. He continued to court Maria Beadnell, who was sent away to Paris for a year, and upon her return, she informed Dickens at his 21st birthday party in February 1833 that she was not interested in marriage. During these years, Dickens staged amateur dramatic performances at his house with a cast of family and friends, and he also continued to write sketches based on his daily observations in London. These sketches, as they were termed, were impressionist and observational written accounts of British society, a format which was popular in the 19th century. One of these, his sketch A Dinner at Poplar Walk, was published anonymously in the December 1833 issue of the Monthly Magazine. He continued to offer sketches to the publication, and in August he adopted the pen name Boz, inspired by the nickname Moses he gave his younger brother Augustus, a name he struggled to pronounce while afflicted with one of his frequent colds. Although he was taking the first steps in a career that would make him the best-known novelist in 19th century England, these initial contributions were unpaid, and Dickens continued to work as a parliamentary reporter and was given a permanent job in August 1834 at the Morning Chronicle. In addition to covering House of Commons debates and political meetings around the country, Dickens wrote sketches for the paper under the name Boz. In late 1834, Dickens moved into his own rented apartment at Furnival's Inn on Holborn, where he lived with his younger brother, Frederick. In January 1835, the Morning Chronicle launched a sister publication, the Evening Chronicle, edited by George Hogarth, a Scottish lawyer and advisor to the novelist Walter Scott. Hogarth frequently invited Dickens to his house in Fulham. There, Charles met his employer's 19-year-old daughter Catherine, and the couple were engaged within a few months. Dickens was soon engaged as the Morning Chronicle's theatre reviewer, and the increasingly busy schedule often made him ill. Nevertheless, he had enough time to put together a collection of his sketches after meeting the historical fiction writer Harrison Ainsworth, who encouraged him to get in touch with the publisher John Macrone and the illustrator George Cruikshank. In October, he was given access to Newgate Prison, giving him material for his sketch A Visit to Newgate, where he described the imagined dreams of a prisoner in his cell awaiting hanging the following morning. 2 volumes of sketches were duly published in February and August 1836 under the title Sketches by Boz, Illustrative of Everyday Life and Everyday People. They were well received, and in his review for the Evening Chronicle, George Hogarth praised the author as a close and acute observer of character and manners. Within a month of the publication of the first volume of his sketches, Dickens was approached by William Hall of Chapman and Hall, with whom he agreed to write monthly sketches illustrated by the young artist Robert Seymour at a rate of £14 each. He soon got to work writing about the adventures of Mr. Pickwick, a jovial, retired businessman. By the time he married Catherine Hogarth on the 2nd of April, 2 installments of what became the Pickwick Papers were already in print, and he continued to write the 3rd while on their honeymoon in Kent. Dickens did not entirely neglect his new wife, and Catherine was soon pregnant with the first of their 10 children, 3 girls and 7 boys. Worryingly, the Pickwick Papers were not selling well, and for the 4th instalment in June, Dickens introduced the Cockney Sam Weller as Pickwick's servant, leading to a sharp increase in its popularity, enjoyed by both rich and poor. Thereafter, Dickens' popularity as a writer increased, and he received more and more commissions to produce novels, articles for monthly magazines like Bentley's Miscellany, and to write comic operas. Then, in February 1837, he began writing his novel Oliver Twist, which was serialized in Bentley's Miscellany across 24 issues. For the next 10 months, aside from commissioning other writers for the Miscellany, Dickens had to divide his time between the comedy of Pickwick and the realist portrayal of the grim existence of English child labourers in Oliver Twist. Around this time, Dickens and his family moved to a large 3-storey house at No. 48 Doughty Street near King's Cross in London, now the Charles Dickens Museum. Catherine's 17-year-old sister, Mary Hogarth, moved in to help with the household chores. Dickens was particularly fond of his sister-in-law and had her read his drafts of Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist. One night, after the 3 visited the theatre in the evening, Mary suddenly collapsed in her room. Despite the intervention of doctors, She died at around 3 o'clock the following afternoon in Dickens' arms. The tragedy left Charles bereft and unable to work, forcing him to inform his publishers that he had to postpone the next instalments of Pickwick and Oliver. While grieving his loss, Dickens developed a close friendship with the literary critic John Forster. In addition to providing Dickens with companionship during Catherine's frequent pregnancies, Forster gave the author advice on his drafts and helped him manage his relationship with his publishers, securing terms for the copyright on Dickens' novels to revert to the author after 3 years. While some of Dickens' publishers resented these renegotiations, Chapman and Hall kept Dickens happy by paying him bonuses on the back of Pickwick's success. Forster soon introduced Dickens to his friends, including the actor William Macready, the young writer William Makepeace Thackeray, and the artist Daniel Maclise, expanding Dickens' literary circle. In June 1837, the elderly King William IV died childless and was succeeded by his 18-year-old niece, Queen Victoria. Dickens would soon become the leading writer of the Victorian age in Britain and is synonymous with Victorian culture today. After renegotiating the terms of his contract with Bentley, with Forster's assistance, Dickens agreed to edit the memoirs of the late Joseph Grimaldi, the comic actor who popularized the clown and served as an early inspiration to Dickens as a child. After finishing Pickwick, Dickens signed an agreement in November with Chapman and Hall for Nicholas Nickleby, a novel following the adventures of the title character as he seeks to make a living for his family, satirizing the draconian conditions of a Yorkshire boarding school where Nicholas ends up beating up the sadistic headmaster, Mr. Squeers. Nickleby was another success and was being adapted for the stage before the final installments were even published. In the late 1830s, as the serialized publication of it was coming to an end, Dickens agreed to prepare Oliver Twist for publication in book form. One of the most influential novels of the age, Oliver Twist is a dark satire of the Victorian workhouse where the orphaned Oliver is lured into the criminal underworld as a pickpocket by Jack Dawkins, the artful dodger. In his quest to escape from the clutches of the criminal mastermind Fagin, Oliver is aided by Nancy, a prostitute and lover of the burglar Bill Sykes. While the artful dodger is arrested and deported to Australia, he mocks the court at his trial and leaves with a smile on his face. Sykes fears Nancy has betrayed him and murders her, shortly before accidentally hanging himself while escaping from a mob, while Fagin is arrested and executed by hanging. The book was published by Bentley and sold well, with Queen Victoria finding it, quote, excessively interesting. In March 1839, Dickens bought a cottage near Exeter for his parents in order to keep his father away from London. Dickens himself liked to be away from London, spending 4 months in the quaint village of Petersham, west of London, before moving his family to Broadstairs in Kent in September, in large part because being away from the smog and fumes of industrial London was beneficial for his perennially poor health and respiratory problem. Around this time, he finished Nicholas Nickleby, which was published in October 1839. Meanwhile, Catherine gave birth to a daughter named Kate, prompting the family to move to larger premises in London at No. 1 Devonshire Terrace near Regent's Park, where they would live on and off for the next decade. Here, Dickens hoped to take a break from writing novels and conceived of a magazine of assorted short stories by himself and others. Although the first issue in April 1840 sold 70,000 copies, the readership soon dropped off, and he decided he needed to give his readers another serialized novel, this one entitled The Old Curiosity Shop. The story focuses on the plight of a 13-year-old orphan named Nell Trent, whose grandfather attempts to provide for her by gambling, only to lose what money he had, leaving him heavily indebted to the villainous hunchback Daniel Quilp. Nell manages to take her grandfather to safety in a remote Midlands village, but dies of exhaustion shortly after their arrival. Immediately thereafter, Dickens, who was a workaholic who produced an enormous body of work in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, decided to continue work on Barnaby Rudge, an historical novel set during the anti-Catholic Gordon riots of 1780. It is one of Dickens' less popular novels, and critics recognised it wasn't his best work. Dickens also realised he needed a break and took a year's sabbatical, one of his few sustained breaks during his life. After celebrating Christmas with their family, Charles and his wife left their 4 children behind in London with governesses and set off for a tour of the United States in January 1842, where Dickens had acquired a minor celebrity status by the early 1840s. The couple arrived in Boston, where Dickens met with the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and was shown round the city by the young Senator Charles Sumner, an anti-slavery champion in Congress. News of the couple's arrival on American shores inspired a mob of American fans demanding their attention. After journeying through New England, Dickens arrived in New York on the 13th of February 1842, and the following evening, New Yorkers held a magnificent ball in his honor, attended by 3,000 guests. On the 18th, Dickens met the writer Washington Irving and persuaded him to organize a petition to Congress, signed by 25 American writers, on the issue of copyright in American publishing, an issue which Dickens was concerned with, believing he was not being properly remunerated for the publication of his work in America. After befriending Edgar Allan Poe in Philadelphia, Dickens travelled on to Washington, where he met President John Tyler, whom he regarded as gentlemanly but uninteresting. He was equally unimpressed by Congress, but wrote to Sumner praising the qualities of Kentucky Senator Henry Clay, who was among the few legislators to support him on the copyright issue. After proceeding to Richmond, Virginia, where he witnessed the inhumanity of slave-owning society, he decided to turn back to the capital and head west to St. Louis, stopping by at Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Louisville on the way. After returning to Cincinnati, they headed north to Buffalo and Niagara Falls en route for Canada, where Dickens visited Toronto, Montreal, and Quebec. After a few days in New York, they left America on the 7th of June and arrived back in England by the end of the month. Dickens spent the summer writing up his American experiences and published American Notes for General Circulation later that year. Although it sold well in America, the author's opposition to slavery and other criticisms of American manners contributed to a decline in his popularity in some sections of society there. Dickens' contempt for the United States was channeled into his next novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, which he began writing for Chapman and Hall in January 1843. While the novel included a couple of great villains, notably the title character's uncle, Jonas Chuzzlewit, and his cousin, Seth Pecksniff, a fraudulent architect, Chuzzlewit was something of a flop, selling around 20,000 copies compared to a peak of 100,000 for the Old Curiosity Shop. Dickens was hurt when Chapman at Hall suggested reducing his payments and asked Forster to look for another publisher. Around this time, Dickens began a philanthropic partnership with his friend Angela Burdett Coutts, inheritor of Coutts Bank, supporting ragged schools for poor children. While Dickens was considering another lengthy break, this time on the European continent, in October 1843, he conceived of a plan to write a short book for Christmas. Published on the 19th of December, A Christmas Carol was the first and best known of Dickens' Christmas stories, describing the ghostly apparitions which appear to the miserly Ebenezer Scrooge and eventually force him to embrace the Christmas spirit of charity and goodwill. It is one of Dickens' best-loved novels today. Although A Christmas Carol sold well and is now understood to have actually influenced many modern Western Christmas traditions, such was its popularity, the expense of producing the book with expensive paper and coloured illustrations meant that it did not solve Dickens' financial woes. After the final instalment of Chuzzlewit was published in June 1844, Dickens broke away from Chapman and Hall and signed an agreement with Bradbury and Evans, who paid him £2,000 for a quarter share of everything he wrote for the next 8 years. This allowed him to take his whole family to Italy, arriving in Genoa in mid-July after travelling through France. After moving into the magnificent Palazzo Peschieri in September, Dickens worked on his second Christmas tale, The Chimes, another attack on the political and social establishment's treatment of the poor. He made a brief trip to London in late November and early December to read the story to his friends before returning to Genoa in time for Christmas. Dickens travelled throughout Italy in 1845 and compiled his recollections in Pictures from Italy, a series of essays including a vivid account of Venice, detailed descriptions of Easter festivities in Rome, and an account of his ascent to the edge of the crater of Mount Vesuvius through snow and ice. After returning to London in July, Dickens, Forster, and a group of friends worked to put on a play, putting on a public performance of Ben Jonson's Every Man in His Humour on the 20th of September, and a couple more private charity performances in November. Dickens had an opportunity to pursue his ambitions of being an actor and continued to put on such performances for the next 12 years. Though they were well attended and received praise from members of the acting profession, it seems the audience was motivated by curiosity to see the famous author on stage, rather than attending for the sake of seeing the play as a whole. During the summer, Bradbury and Evans informed Dickens of a project to set up a new liberal newspaper, the Daily News, and Dickens agreed to edit it for £2,000 a year. He hired the social reformer Douglas Jerrold to write political pieces, sent his uncle John Barrow to report on the Anglo-Sikh War in the Punjab, and engaged his father-in-law George Hogarth as music critic. Rather surprisingly, he turned to his father to manage the reporters, and, even more surprisingly, John Dickens did a good job. The Daily News launched on the 21st of January 1846. The key political issue of the day was the debate over the Corn Laws, which placed duties on imported corn to protect farmers at the expense of higher prices for the people. Soon, the Conservative Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, declared that he was in favour of repealing the Corn Laws, a decision that would split his party. Dickens took his family to Switzerland in June 1846, before relocating to Paris in the late autumn. Spending the Christmas and New Year season here, he met such literary luminaries as Alexandre Dumas, François-René de Chateaubriand, and Victor Hugo in the French capital. During this time, Dickens began work on Dombey and Son. The story revolves around Paul Dombey, the owner of a shipping firm who desperately seeks a son and heir for his business. Having already given him a 6-year-old daughter, Florence, Dombey's wife dies after giving birth to a son, also named Paul. The elder Dombey neglects Florence, who is comforted by the kindly Polly Toodle, the baby's wet nurse. When Polly is dismissed after allowing Florence to get lost in Camden Town, little Paul gets sick and is taken with his sister to the autocratic Mrs. Pipchin in Brighton. Paul is then sent to a draconian school where his health continues to deteriorate, eventually leading to his death. Dombey further neglects Florence and marries for a second time to Edith, who later runs off. Florence marries Dombey's employee, Walter, who eventually manages to arrange a reconciliation between father and daughter before Dombey's death. Though contemporaries were critical of the quality of the second half of the novel, completed in April 1848, Dombey and Son has been praised as a critique of the social problems of the day and was one of Dickens' best-selling novels. Dickens had moved back to London by March 1847. In the year that followed, his social conscience was on display as he set up a shelter for homeless women after acquiring Urania Cottage in Shepherd's Bush. Dickens would manage the shelter for the next decade. Women who came here were clothed, fed, and taught to read and write. In 1848, after Forster published a biography of the 18th century writer Oliver Goldsmith, Dickens asked his friend to be his biographer and began sharing more details of his early life. The year saw a wave of liberal revolutions spread throughout Europe, overthrowing King Louis-Philippe in France and destabilizing the monarchies in Prussia, Austria, and the Italian principalities. Dickens was tempted by an invitation to stand as a radical liberal member of Parliament in London, but decided against it when he realized he would not have time to write. The following year, Dickens began work on what would be one of his most iconic novels, David Copperfield, a semi-autobiographical work describing a young boy separated from his mother and punished by his stepfather. The story is told from David's first-person perspective, allowing Dickens to describe David's evolution as he develops an infatuation with James Steerforth, an older boy at his boarding school. Dickens channels his parents in the characters of Mr. and Mrs. Micawber, David's kindly landlord, who is prone to getting himself into financial trouble and is sent to debtors' prison, much as Charles's father had. After Micawber's imprisonment, David lodges with Mr. Wickfield and his daughter Agnes, who falls in love with David while seeking to escape the attentions of Wickfield's villainous clerk, Uriah Heep. David then falls in love with the pretty Dora Spenlow, inspired by his youthful courtship of Maria Beadnell, but she then dies and David marries Agnes. David Copperfield was serialised by Bradbury and Evans between May 1849 and November 1850 and became Dickens' best-known novel, as well as his personal favourite. By that time, Dickens was in his late 30s, a successful and at last financially secure writer who had already written such masterpieces as Oliver Twist, The Old Curiosity Shop, and A Christmas Carol. He was associated with the social reform movement and had established a refuge for fallen women, and at home he was the father of 8 children, the eldest of which, 13-year-old Charles, was due to start at Eton in January 1850. In March 1850, Dickens launched a new periodical, Household Words, aimed at social improvement. Though the articles were to be published anonymously, the writer Elizabeth Gaskell became a frequent contributor, while Dickens himself wrote articles about public health, education, and housing. In the meantime, his expanding social circle included Lord John Russell, Liberal Prime Minister between 1846 and 1852, who became one of the few politicians Dickens admired. In 1851, Dickens befriended the young Wilkie Collins, who would later become a collaborator. On the 31st of March 1851, John Dickens died at the age of 65, a loss that his son mourned deeply, despite his father's wayward finances and the troubles it had caused the family over many years. There was further anguish when, a fortnight later, Dickens' daughter Dora died suddenly at 9 months old. The family tragedies prevented him from working on another novel, though he did have time to write A Child's History of England, covering the history of England from ancient times to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. In December 1851, he began work on Bleak House, a satire on the legal profession which Dickens had come to detest. The plot revolves around a legal case, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, which runs for decades with multiple claimants contesting a will which only ends when the entire estate has been absorbed by legal costs, rendering any further litigation pointless. Although the novel was poorly received by critics, Dickens managed to sell around 40,000 copies every month from March 1852 to September 1853, and in all, Dickens made £11,000 from the book. He followed up with Hard Times, an unusually short novel by Dickens' standards, published between April and August 1854 in 20 weekly instalments of Household Words in an effort to boost circulation of the periodical. Set in Coketown, a fictional northern mill town based on Preston in Lancashire, the novel critiques industrialisation while also channeling Dickens' message that education is not best provided through formulaic cramming of facts, but through humour and entertainment. While the strict class teacher Mr. Gradgrind's draconian ways cause his own children to rebel against him, the story's heroine, Cecilia Jupe, a circus girl, serves to remind Gradgrind that life is about creativity and amusement. Although Catherine had given birth to a 10th child and 7th son named Edward in March 1852, Dickens' relationship with his wife deteriorated over the course of the decade. Dickens had confided to his friends his fears that he and his wife had incompatible personalities. While he seemed to appreciate the stability and domesticity that Catherine brought to the family, Dickens enjoyed being outdoors on long walks and adventures with his male friends, while Catherine preferred to stay at home. As a famous author, Dickens had no shortage of female admirers, and he was not unaccustomed to flirting with them, which inspired jealousy in his wife. In September, Dickens took his family to Boulogne in France, where they witnessed the French preparations for the Crimean War, prompted by the British and French desire to curb Russian ambitions in the Balkans, in Southeast Europe, and the Black Sea. While Dickens had generally refrained from commenting on international affairs, reports of bungled military leadership and poorly equipped soldiers prompted him to write articles criticizing the government in Household Words. He was also inspired to write a novel mocking the government under the title Nobody's Fault, but by September 1855 he decided to change it to Little Dorrit, the first installment of which appeared in December. The title character, 22-year-old Amy Dorrit, is the youngest daughter of William Dorrit, a debt prisoner at Marshalsea, and has spent her whole life in the prison. Amy is devoted to her father and does everything she can to help him financially, a situation that Dickens himself was familiar with. Much of the story focuses on Amy's relationship with the businessman Arthur Clennam, a sentimental middle-aged man, before William Dorrit comes into a large inheritance and pays his way out of prison. Thereafter, the key theme is how the Dorrits respond to their changed financial situation. While writing Little Dorrit, Dickens had been searching for a house in Kent. He saw that the mansion at Gads Hill was for sale and found that it was owned by the writer Eliza Lynn Linton, a contributor to Household Words, and by March 1856, Dickens bought the house for £1,700, though it would be more than a year until he moved in. The previous October, he had gone with his sister-in-law Georgina to find an apartment in Paris on the Champs-Élysées, and during his stay in Paris, he negotiated an agreement with the publishing firm Hachette to produce a collection of all his novels translated into French. While spending increasing amounts of his time in France, in the latter half of 1856, Dickens occupied himself with staging a production of a play at Tavistock House to mark his eldest son Charles's 20th birthday in January 1857. The spectacle was to be The Frozen Deep, a tragedy by his friend Wilkie Collins, inspired by Sir John Franklin's doomed expedition to discover the fabled Northwest Passage in North America in 1845. The show was staged on 4 occasions to packed audiences, and it was revived in July for a performance in front of Queen Victoria. In late August, Dickens agreed to stage it in Manchester to raise money for the family of his late friend Douglas Jerrold. Among the players on stage were the veteran actress Frances Ternan and her 2 daughters, Maria and Ellen, also known as Nellie. Dickens' meeting with the Ternans proved a major turning point in his life. He desired to make the 18-year-old Ellen his mistress and began sleeping separately from his wife at Tavistock House. The emotional turmoil hindered his ability to write, and Dickens began holding paid readings of his work, which were well attended. By the middle of 1858, he and Catherine had effectively separated, and the latter was obliged to move in with her elderly parents. While his eldest son Charles sided with his mother, Georgina Hogarth remained loyal to Dickens and distanced herself from her family. Rumours consequently abounded that Dickens was not only having an affair with a young actress, but also his sister-in-law. In an effort to justify himself, Dickens wrote a letter published in the New York Tribune on the 16th of August 1858 and soon reprinted in English papers, in which he claimed that Catherine was mentally ill, that the marriage had been unhappy for many years, and it was only Georgina that prevented an earlier separation. At the same time, he denied having an affair with Ellen Ternan, without naming her, though he continued to act as a benefactor for her family. Thackeray and Elizabeth Gaskell were among the friends who criticised Dickens for sharing details of his private life. With his social circle divided and old friends deserting him, Dickens sought relief from his adoring audiences at public readings, and in August 1858 he embarked on a tour of Scotland and Ireland to give 85 readings. When Bradbury and Evans refused to print a personal statement from Dickens about his marriage in Punch magazine, Dickens instructed Forster to wind down the relationship, leading to the closure of Household Words at the end of May 1859. Dickens decided to launch a new magazine himself, which he hoped to call Household Harmony, but Forster cautioned him that it may draw attention to the disharmony in Dickens' own household, and the periodical was instead called All the Year Round. Dickens continued to provide financial support to the Ternans and paid for Ellen and her sisters Fanny and Maria to move into a large house at Houghton Place near Mornington Crescent in March 1859. Dickens was hard at work managing the launch of All the Year Round, the first edition of which appeared on the 30th of April 1859. This first edition included the initial instalment of Dickens' latest novel entitled A Tale of Two Cities. It would become his most popular novel yet. Set in London and Paris, the novel follows three French families in the late 18th century as the country descends into the French Revolution of 1789. The famous opening lines, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness," introduced the contrast between the glamorous lives of the aristocracy and the poverty of the lower classes before the Revolution. Dickens' usual themes of crime, cruelty, injustice, and deceit are found throughout the novel, which ends with the climactic execution at the guillotine of the English lawyer Sidney Carton, who nobly sacrifices himself by taking the place of his French love rival, proclaiming that, quote, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." A Tale of Two Cities ran weekly between April and November 1859. Thereafter, in 1860, the 48-year-old Dickens entered the final decade of his life, much of which was spent giving readings and writing journalistic articles for his periodical. In October 1860, he started work on another of his most canonical novels, Great Expectations. The story is narrated by Pip, a young orphan who grows up with his bad-tempered adult sister and her husband Joe. A few years later, Pip is taken to the eccentric Miss Havisham, who has allowed her fine house to decay and continues to wear her wedding dress after being jilted at the altar many, many years earlier. Pip falls in love with her adopted daughter Estella, who responds coldly. Pip's fortunes are transformed when a lawyer informs him that an anonymous benefactor has given him a large sum of money, following which Pip goes to London to train as a lawyer. There he confides to a friend, Herbert Pocket, that he wishes to marry Estella. Pip later learns that his mysterious benefactor was not Miss Havisham, as he had been led to believe, but Abel Magwitch, a convict he encountered as a child who had made a fortune after being transported to Australia, a revelation that leads Pip to stop taking Magwitch's money. Pip sees Miss Havisham and Estella and declares his love, only for the latter to inform him that she is planning to marry someone else. In a further meeting with Miss Havisham, the latter tells Pip her life history and how she raised Estella to take advantage of men, but as Pip is taking his leave, her dress catches on fire and he is unable to save her. Pip eventually realizes that Estella is the daughter of Magwitch, who has been fatally injured during a botched attempt to slip back to Australia. Pip joins Herbert Pocket at a shipbroking firm in Egypt before returning to England, where he meets Estella. The ending is left deliberately ambiguous, with the reader left wondering what will come of Pip and Estella's relationship. Dickens had been suffering from ill health as he wrote these two great novels. His love for Ellen remained unconsummated, prompting him to seek alternative remedies, and his letters to his doctor suggested that he was being afflicted by venereal disease, and he also faced a painful bout of rheumatism in the latter half of 1860 during a particularly cold winter. He continued to be estranged from many of his friends, though he retained the unwavering loyalty of Forster. As if to rid the ghosts of his past, in September 1860, he burned thousands of the letters he had received over the years in a bonfire at Gads Hill without consulting Forster, his appointed biographer. Although he was no longer managing the women's refuge he had set up years earlier, Dickens was financially supporting the households of 3 women: his elderly mother, his estranged wife, and the Ternans at Houghton Place. In 1862, the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky met Dickens at the offices of his magazine at Wellington Street in Covent Garden. Dostoevsky recalled that Dickens told him that his characters were based on 2 parts of his personality, and while he aspired to follow the example of his good and virtuous characters, he more frequently behaved as one of his villains. Whatever Dickens' own moral failings might have been, he continued to give readings around the country to large audiences, boasting to Forster that he was earning up to £190 a night in London. Dickens had been considering a second visit to America, but with the outbreak of the American Civil War in April 1861, he set aside the idea. He continued to visit the theatre and spared no effort in promoting the Ternan sisters, Fanny and Maria, though Ellen herself had stopped performing. For the next few years, Dickens was often in France, crossing the Channel on almost 70 occasions between 1862 and 1865. The journalist Claire Tomerlin, who has written biographies of both Dickens and Ellen, argues that the relationship had been consummated and Dickens set Ellen up in Paris to hide her pregnancy. Though Nellie later destroyed all her correspondence with Dickens, there is circumstantial evidence suggesting that she gave birth to a son in early 1863 who died in the spring of 1865. Death seemed to stalk Dickens as his mother and mother-in-law died within weeks of each other in 1863. In February 1864, he learned of the death of his second son, Walter, who had been serving with the Indian Army since 1857. Dickens did no readings for the year, preferring to work on his latest novel, Our Mutual Friend, a satire on the importance of money in London in the 1860s, published by his old publishers, Chapman and Hall, in 19 instalments between May 1864 and November 1865. On the 9th of June 1865, while Dickens was returning from Paris to England with Ellen, their train derailed at a railway bridge under repair near Staplehurst in Kent, with the leading carriages crashing into the river below. While their first-class carriage remained on the track, Dickens was badly shaken and helped the injured and dying victims before returning to the carriage to retrieve the manuscript of the latest instalment of Our Mutual Friend. Although Our Mutual Friend was not as popular as many of his previous novels, with the final instalment selling fewer than 20,000 copies, it attracted advertisers and allowed the author to share a modest profit with his publishers. Dickens continued to spend time with the Ternans and put up Nellie in a cottage in Slough, renting another nearby for himself under the name Charles Tringham. In July 1866, he agreed to publish Fanny Ternan's debut novel, Aunt Margaret's Trouble, shortly before her marriage to Thomas Trollope, the brother of the author Anthony Trollope. The same year, Dickens resumed his reading tours, which were organised by George Dolby, an unemployed theatre manager who soon became a close friend. A 3-month tour of northern England and Scotland in the spring of 1866 was followed by a trip to Ireland and Wales at the beginning of the following year, but the most ambitious item on the agenda was a return to the United States. Despite his increasingly poor health, these reading tours enabled Dickens to make good money to support his large number of dependents. Though Nellie hoped to accompany Dickens to America, it was impossible to find a respectable explanation for her presence, and instead she went with her mother to Italy to join her sister Fanny and her husband in Florence. In early November 1867, Dickens left Liverpool and arrived in Boston 10 days later on the 19th. After meeting old friends, including Longfellow and Ralph Waldo Emerson, the readings began on the 2nd of December, attracting lines of people stretching for miles, hoping to watch the great author perform, failing to be kept away even by the snowstorms which struck New York that winter. The cold weather caused Dickens to suffer from one of his habitual colds, which he struggled to expel, and he and Dolby decided to cut down the itinerary, which originally extended west to Chicago and north to Canada. On his 56th birthday, on the 7th of February 1868, he met President Andrew Johnson in Washington, but did not leave behind any account of their conversation. In a speech to the New York press on the 18th of April, he told the audience that he was impressed by the transformation in the country since his previous visit a quarter of a century earlier. Then, after making £20,000 from the tour, Dickens embarked on the return crossing on the 23rd of April, arriving in Liverpool on the 1st of May. He may have spent a week in Slough with Nellie, who returned from Italy a week earlier, before a homecoming party at Gads Hill on the 9th of May. Dickens had been suffering from gout in America, and by the time he returned to England, he and Dombey decided to plan a farewell tour beginning in October 1868. He was contracted to do 100 readings and managed around 30 before the end of the year, including visits to Scotland and Ireland. In January 1869, Dickens introduced a new routine, dramatising Nancy's murder by Sikes in Oliver Twist, and revelled in the fact that his audience was horrified by the performance. The experience took a toll on Dickens' own health, and each performance of the scene left him paralysed for several minutes before he recovered, and on the 18th of April he suffered a stroke in Chester. Though he soldiered on, by the time he reached Preston on the 22nd, he was advised by his doctor to cancel the rest of the tour and taken back to London for further examination. Within a few months, he was well enough to take friends on walking tours in East London and Kent. In August, he started thinking about a new murder mystery novel, and in October, he settled on the title The Mystery of Edwin Drood, scheduled for publication in 12 instalments from March 1870. Although Dombey questioned whether his health would stand up to it, Dickens insisted on giving a final series of 12 public readings in London to make up for the curtailed farewell tour. The readings began on the 11th of January 1870. Despite his frail health, Dickens continued to perform the Sikes and Nancy scene, even though it took him more than 10 minutes to recover from the ordeal. After performing the scene for the last time on the 8th of March at his penultimate scheduled performance, Dickens went to Buckingham Palace to meet Queen Victoria on the 9th of March. The Queen regretted that she had never heard Dickens read from his work, and Dickens told her that he did not give private readings, but promised to give her a specially bound set of his collected works. On the 15th of March, he gave his final reading at St. James's Hall to an audience of 2,000 people, with many more turned away at the door, reading from A Christmas Carol and Pickwick Papers. As he left the stage for his final farewell, Dickens told his audience to expect the first instalment of his new novel in 2 weeks. While he continued to work on The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Dickens greatly lamented the death of his old friend Daniel Maclise on the 25th of April, and gave a moving speech in his memory on the 30th of April at the Royal Academy. On the 25th of May, he left for Gads Hill, returning to London briefly on the 2nd of June, the day his son Charles took over as editor of All the Year Round. On the evening of the 8th of June, Dickens was feeling unwell at Gads Hill, and Georgina recalled him speaking incoherently as he sought to continue with his plans to have dinner and to go to London. In response to Georgina suggesting that he lie down, Dickens responded, "Yes, on the ground," before collapsing on the dining room floor. Doctors were summoned and placed him on a sofa, before pronouncing that he had suffered a brain hemorrhage and that there was nothing more to be done. At around 6 in the evening of the 9th of June 1870, Charles Dickens died at the age of 58. He was prematurely aged, photos of him from the 1860s suggesting a man well into his 60s. His strenuous work schedule and touring, poor respiratory health throughout his life, and also a large alcohol intake over many years had taken their toll. His final novel was left unfinished halfway through, leaving few clues as to how he intended to finish it, although the remaining instalments were published up to September 1870. A grave was dug for Dickens at Rochester Cathedral, but After a Times editorial calling for the author to be buried at Westminster Abbey, Forster and Charles Dickens Jr. received permission from the Dean of the Abbey for him to be buried at the famous Poets' Corner in a simple ceremony on the 14th of June 1870. Charles Dickens is often considered the greatest English novelist of the Victorian era. He had been born into poverty, and his early experiences enabled him to leave behind vivid descriptions of the precarious existence of England's lower classes in the 19th century. Although he had begun his career as a parliamentary reporter and was a supporter of liberal causes, Dickens distrusted politicians in Parliament and preferred to promote his political causes through his writing. Dickens was also heavily involved in his own philanthropic initiatives, most notably in setting up and managing a refuge for women found on the streets. However, like many great writers, including his Russian contemporary and admirer Leo Tolstoy, Dickens often failed to live up to the standard of morality set by the characters in his novels. The author of the noble sentiments found in A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations was also the man who callously separated from the mother of his 10 children after more than 2 decades of marriage and criticized her character in public while pursuing a woman less than half his age. Despite the scandal around his personal life, Dickens remained popular and successful as a writer and performer, appealing to a wide readership that ranged from the urban poor to Queen Victoria. His novels, notably Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, Great Expectations, David Copperfield, and A Tale of Two Cities, are considered some of the greatest ever written in the English language. What do you think of Charles Dickens? Did he fail to live according to the values that he hoped to encourage in others? Or was he someone who understood the frequent struggles between noble and base instincts that forms part of the human condition? And was he successful in conveying them through his writing, a quality that has enabled his novels to retain a sense of timelessness despite their unfamiliar setting? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.